Thrilled at the stories that have been told and the reports that have been given, and you've already answered a question that is the theme for today and for this week, and that question is, now what? And you are doing the what that God has called us and called you to. But I want to see if we can take another look at how to answer that question, going back to Jesus. So Jesus, he never traveled very far. He was born in Bethlehem. He grew up and lived much of his life in Nazareth. They are 68 miles apart. So that's roughly the distance from here to Richmond. And with the exception of a short stint as a preschooler or a refugee in Egypt, Jesus spent all of his 33 years on earth within about a 50-mile radius. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick survey here, and I need your help. How many of you were born in Virginia? Wow. How many of you have traveled outside of Virginia? Not as many. Oh, wow, all right. How many of you have traveled outside the United States? Wow. Okay, West Virginia does not count. Just want to be sure we got that right. So, actually, pretty much everyone here has traveled a whole lot farther and a whole lot more than Jesus ever traveled. And yet he repeatedly talked about his compassion for the nations. And he didn't use the word, they didn't use the word then the same way we do today, referring to about 196 countries around the world. The Greek word ethne referred to people groups. So there are about 7,000 different languages spoken around the globe. Throw in dialects, and the number is about 10,000. If you add other distinctions of culture and caste and race, the number of people groups in the world comes to around 20,000. So there is enormous diversity. But diversity doesn't mean there's contact, and diversity doesn't mean there is compassion. In the first century, there were Jews and Romans who lived within proximity to each other, who would never speak to each other or have any contact together. But Jesus was different. He had conversations, he had contact with a Samaritan woman and a Roman officer that his fellow Orthodox Jews never would have talked to. But then, most amazingly, he commissioned his followers to make disciples of all the ethne, of all the groups, every gender, every race, every language, every country. He had a concern and a compassion for people that was extraordinary. But in the Bible, it didn't start with Jesus. It's certainly in the Old Testament. You go back 8 centuries before Jesus to the prophet Micah, answering the profound question, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Okay, so justice, that's fairness, that's righteousness, that's impartiality. That's good. But then to love mercy, our English word mercy is defined as kindness and forgiveness, especially when you could harm or hurt someone and you choose not to do it. So you could practice justice, but you choose not to. So this is someone whom you could fire at work justly. This is someone you can deport. This is someone you can evict. This is someone you can divorce. This is someone that you can get even with. And you can do it all justly, but you choose not to do it. That is mercy. That is compassion. And God's compassion for others, his call for his people to be compassionate, it's woven through the Old Testament law. So if you are one of those who regularly reads through the Bible and you actually read all of the laws in the book of Leviticus, then you already know some of the lines that are there. Remember, this was an agricultural society. So just a few lines from Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Same chapter. When an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself. For you were aliens in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And that's kind of amazing. The people of Israel have planted, they have watered, they've come to the harvest, but don't harvest all your field. Leave some of it for those that are poor and those that are aliens. You have a vineyard? All right, if you have a vineyard and there are grapes that drop, don't pick them up. And there are clusters at the edges, leave them on the vine. And it's not just doing it out of some legalistic requirement. It is loving to do that. Loving to have that kind of mercy toward other people. God called them to love and treat aliens as if they were natives in Israel. All right, so let's talk for a minute about Napoleon Bonaparte. He was, of course, a brilliant 19th century military leader. He was the Emperor of France and an Emperor of the United States of America. We sometimes forget that in history, but before a president named Thomas Jefferson did something that at the time he was accused of being totally unconstitutional, and that was going into the real estate business and buying the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Before then, Bonaparte was the emperor from New Orleans to Montana. He was the emperor of the western part of Minnesota, where I live. He was the emperor of Iowa, Missouri, and parts of Texas and Oklahoma. But, you know, his heritage, what he left behind, was not so much that. It was a whole new vision that was kind of different for the beginning of the 1800s. It's called the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code called for justice, for religious freedom, that the way you got government jobs was not based upon what was your family name and background, but whether or not you had merit and how good you were at the job that you would be able to do. An emphasis that Napoleon claimed would bring justice all across Europe, a pan-European justice. I say all that because it relates to an old and perhaps to you familiar story about a soldier in Napoleon's army who was slated for imminent execution, and his mother, the story goes, came and pleaded for his life and asked that he be pardoned. She actually got to the emperor, and Napoleon said no because he deserved justice, and this was his second offense, and it would not be just to pardon him. She said, I'm not asking for justice, I'm asking for mercy. So the emperor replied and said, he doesn't deserve mercy. And she said, it wouldn't be mercy if he deserved it. And the story goes that he was then granted a pardon. And that's the way God treats us. That he goes beyond justice, what he could justly do to condemn us, but instead he is merciful, he is kind and forgiving, and where he could legitimately harm or hurt us, he chooses not to do it. And that's the kind of compassion that God has for the people we've talked about today, not just in Virginia, but from California to Ghana. That kind of compassion. So the question for today is, now what? And there are a lot of different answers to that question, but let's just consider two. To help the poor and to make disciples. So at the launching of Jesus' ministry in Luke 4:18, Jesus said that he came to preach the good news to the poor. So Jesus started out with those who were on the margins of society. He repeatedly clashed with those who were rich and those who were powerful. He pursued those who were poor and sick and imprisoned, those who were disenfranchised. I had heard that there are more references to the poor than just about anyone or anything else in the Bible. And so I did something, maybe you've done it. If not, it really is an amazing undertaking. And that is, if you have a Bible program on your computer, put in words like poor and poverty. And I read all of the references, all the way through the Old Testament and the New. It really didn't take very long. And all of these lines in the Bible, verses that talk about the homeless, about the widow, about the orphan, about the leper, and always in a context of kindness and respect for the imprisoned, for the desperate. Until after you read all of these again and again in the Bible, you quickly decide that Jesus, that God, old and new, have a bent toward concern for the poor. I mean, there's so many examples. I'll just give you one of the examples from Deuteronomy 15:11, a verse, unfortunately, that sometimes is only partially quoted. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your brothers and toward the poor that are in the land. So most people in most of history have been poor. Most people in the world today are poor. And some are exceptionally poor. All right, let's go back 27 years to 1990. 43% of the population of the world at that time lived on less than $1.25 per day. $1.25 per day, this is a global perspective, is at best able to provide, if food is available to somehow be purchased or otherwise gotten, less than 2,000 calories per day. So 43% of the people in the world so poor that they are on subsistence, if not starvation, diets. In the year 2000, 180-some nations of the world joined in the UN Millennial Goals, and one of those goals was within 15 years, from 2000 to 2015, reduce extreme poverty in the world by half. Let me just say, on the face of it, that was crazy, because it was obvious it couldn't be done. Nothing like that had ever been attempted before in history. Nothing like that had ever been accomplished before in history. To cut in half the number of people, we're talking a lot of people, cut the number in half within 15 years, impossible. Except that goal was reached 5 years ahead of schedule. So in 2000, 43% of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. 10 years later, in 2010, it was down to 21% of the population of the world in extreme poverty. And the United States, we had our part, a good part in it. I mean, I just love what USAID has done to help the poor and the needy who are in the world. And it makes me